us. Thank you for joining us for this very interesting webinar that is being organized by the African Feminist Collective on Feminist-Informed Foreign Policies. The theme for this webinar is Towards Transformative Justice, a Pan-African feminist approach to reparations. Just to give us a bit of a background, since 1962, when the Organization for African Unity turned to African Union, there's been discussions around reparations. In 1963, there was a conference that was held in Abuja that came up with the Abuja Declaration, proclamation on reparations. And since then, in 2001, the UN conference that came up with the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, followed by 2021 AU Continental Experts Meeting, 2022 resolution that was adopted by the African Commission on People and Human Rights, to 2023, the African Union Ordinary Section Assembly of Heads of State that also proposed a conference in Ghana to follow up on this. And just to mention that Ghana has been one country that has really led the discussions on reparations. We have, as AFIP Collective, noted that reparations has re-emerged as a central political demand across Africa. Yet on the continent, the discourse on reparations remains dominated by states, diplomats, and the academy, limiting broader discussions and often reproducing a narrow understanding of harm as extractable, quantifiable, and largely experienced by men. This framing obscures the reality that colonialism and slavery were gendered regimes of accumulation, reliant on the control, exploitation, and disciplining of African women's bodies, labor, fertility, land relations, and social authority. So we call this webinar because we would like to have a conversation in terms of what transformative reparations and transformative justice should look like in terms of addressing the gendered foundations of colonial and post-colonial harm. We hope to expose the limitations of gender-neutral and state-centric reparation approaches in adequately addressing gendered harms. We would like to connect historical gendered harms to contemporary economic, ecological, and social crises. We would like to strengthen feminist advocacy agenda, agenda for reparations within the African Union, regional bodies, and national policy spaces. We want, through this webinar, to build a shared feminist agenda for advocacy, policy engagement, and movement building around reparations that is rooted on the continent and accountable to the women's movement. Finally, we would like, during this webinar, to launch the African Feminist Informed Policies Collectives framework on reparations. So we are basically making a proposal on what a transformative feminist reparations in Africa should look like. So we've articulated our position, but this webinar, we are going to be hearing from a number of African feminists who have also been working around these issues, and there are 3 of them. So we are going to be taking each one of them, starting with Associate Professor Njoki Wamai, who is an assistant professor in International Relations Department at Kenya's oldest private university, United States International University of Africa, based in Kenya. She was previously a postdoctoral researcher at the Politics and International Studies Department as well. But currently, her research do look at issues of transitional justice, critical theory, politics of Africa, African feminisms, and development of political thoughts from Africa. After her, we'll be listening to Panashe Chigumadzi, who is an award-winning writer, scholar, and historian. She's an assistant professor of African history at Brandeis University and a visiting scholar at the University of Cape Town. I mean, she's a publisher. Before this time, I listened to a lot of her videos. speaking about, history. She's currently an Open Society Foundation Fellow and has previously held fellowships such as the Dorothy Porter and Charles Harris Wesley Fellow at Harvard's Hussein Center for Africa and African American Research, and Fellow in Residence at Iowa University's International Writers Program. And finally, we'll be listening to Toni Haastrup, who is going to be presenting the the AFIP paper on Towards Transformative Justice, a position paper on a pan-African feminist approach to reparations. Toni is chair in global politics at the University of Manchester, and she holds a PhD in politics from University of Edinburgh. Of course, we know Toni's activism and research is around international policies. She looks at how post-colonial and decolonial approaches to international relations and regional and global governance itself impacts on feminism and women, peace and security in Africa. She works with a number of government organs, international organizations, both in African Union, and she's written a lot about feminist foreign policies. So we have these three speakers who are going to be taking us through this evening. But before we start, I would like to welcome all of you and say, please introduce yourselves in the chat because we wouldn't have the opportunity to have everyone talk about themselves. We are very open to receiving your questions. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and I'm going to be picking them up. We are going to have opportunities at some point to interact with you. So if you have any questions, please hold on to it. We'll take it after the speakers, and then we come back to you to have a conversation. We hope that this will be an open conversation that would also allow us not only to share our thoughts, but also to hear from you what your perceptions are in terms of what a transformative reparations and feminist reparations agenda will look like in Africa. So I'm going to be starting off with Njoki, and I'm going to ask Njoki to please share with us how colonial gendered violence persists through neoliberal economic systems, unpaid care work, climate injustice, and extractivism, and what reparations should deliver in this context. Njoki, you have 10 to 12 minutes.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Amazing. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Helen. And thank you again. I also want to join you in thanking all those who have found time to join us for this webinar right now. Because we know there are too many things, but thank you for finding time to be with us at the African Feminist Informed Policy Collective. So as Helen introduced me, my name is Njoki Wamai, and I'm an assistant professor in politics and international studies, and also at the USIU University here in Kenya. And I also do research and consulting on issues to do with gender and gender justice. So I'm going to be responding to this issue of context, and I think by providing this context of the impact of colonialism and why gender violence continues to persist through the different systems, by the time I think Toni will come, we will see then why we need to have. We are launching this policy brief on reparations. So my role here is to really give a background and a context. And I just want to say that on this African feminist perspectives to reparations, and if we look at many of the not just African countries, but mainly African countries, because that's what our collective looks at, is that if you look at colonialism, and I know many of the countries, the colonialism, let's say, formal colonialism ended in the 60s. Of course, some like Zimbabwe and others, Angola extended way much later. But colonial gender violence did not end with independence. I think that's one thing we need to agree. And it did not end with independence, because there is always this this understanding that, let's move on. No, it did not end with independence. And sadly, it continues to mutate through neoliberal economic systems. And that's why we cannot ignore that colonialism continues to date, and we're going to look at the various ways that it continues through unpaid care work, climate injustice, extractivism, and what then, if it continues through these ways and many others, what then should reparations deliver in this context? And so that's why we're saying reparations then must be feminist, they must be intersectional, they must be transformative and not tokenistic. Because there's a lot of conversations, as we've seen, on reparations, especially this last year when we had the AU Year of Reparations. So if we look at colonial gendered violence, what happened during the colonial era? Women's bodies and labor were sites of control. There were also sites of violence. Women's bodies were sites of where violence happened, and not just, and especially colonial violence. African women's bodies, to be specific. And my name is Njoki, where I come from, a place called Nyeri here in Kenya. Many women during not just the Mau Mau War, but even before that and after, faced a lot of colonial violence. And when we had the Mau Mau case versus the British a couple of years ago, many women, many Kenyan women from where I come from, testified because of the sexual violence that happened. So our women's bodies are not just, it was not unique to women in central Kenya. It was widespread around Kenya, around many African countries. We all know the different stories from Nigeria. Then that's why we had like the Aba women protesting, to South Africa. So across Africa, so women's bodies have been first a site for colonial violence, and secondly, as a site for labor extraction. So a site for violence, a site, and of course through sexual violence, a site for labor extraction. So labor was used, of course, as a site of control, so a site for violence, and also a site for labor. And very many women were taken to labor camps to build things during the colonial times. So like the airport in Kenya was built largely by women who had been held during the Mau Mau era. So we have seen that. So during the colonial times, women's bodies used as sites for violence, for colonial violence, and then sites for labor, again colonial labor that was unpaid, you know. And then coming to the neoliberal era, so there are continuities from colonialism to the neoliberal era, with the structural adjustment programs, privatization, of so many programs, where women are then forced to do the care work, because like healthcare was privatized, education, everything. So structural adjustment programs, privatization, and austerity programs. And as you may know, in many African countries, we are going through another structural adjustment program after the first one that happened in the late 90s. Many countries are in like a structural adjustment program relationship with the IMF, including Kenya. And this also austerity adjustment programs has reproduced dispossession, it has deepened inequality, and of course feminized poverty. And so looking at this, or rather the point I'm trying to make of colonial gendered violence that has continued from colonialism, where women's bodies, as I said, were a site of violence and a site of free labor, to date, where now women continue to do the unpaid care work, and especially also after the structural adjustment programs introduced through neoliberal reforms by the IMF and World Bank in relationship with different countries. So it shows violence is systemic, it is not episodic. And so it is embedded in the logics, in the economic logic. So when we think about violence, we need to see it as a systemic issue that is embedded in the economic logics of neoliberalism. And the second point I want to make about unpaid care work, again, as we've seen, it has colonial roots. So women's reproductive labor was devalued and naturalized during colonialism. And there are lots of case studies across Africa where women were forced, as much as men would be maybe conscripted to wars outside the continent, women then were forced to be doing the everyday kind of labor, going to labor camps, planting things, or forced labor of cash crops. Those of you countries where coffee, tea, cocoa is planted, rubber. So women were forced for the colonial project to continue doing colonial work. So unpaid care work has always been part of what we do. And then women, so that means women's reproductive labor was devalued and naturalized. Yeah. And so and beyond that, of course, women have always been, especially African women, have always been also exploited in sex work across. Even then, there was a lot of violence against women, and some, sex workers. So, and that continues to date. Again, as we know, we find Black women across the world are the least paid, most invisible in care work, whether it is in domestic work, or whether it is doing work, the care work in hospitals, nurses, nurse aides, or even like sex work. It's Black women who are transported across, and brown women. You'll not hear. So these challenges, again, this is still care work, and we need to also see even sex work as a form of care work that is unpaid. So with the neoliberal intensification, cuts in public services always shift the burden of care onto women. And I think all of us went through COVID, and we don't need even to belabor the point. As many women became the care workers for their families, for their community. So again, reducing the time they would spend in doing what we call productive gender work to reproductive gender roles. So again, if we're going to when we're demanding for reparations, we demand recognition, redistribution, and investment in care infrastructure, and also we demand that we recognize the disproportionate time, which should be converted into money in this neoliberal economic logics, that women invest in care work, because the current infrastructure of thinking through economics doesn't cater for care work, as much as a few conversations are starting. And then going to climate justice or climate injustice. Again, this is an issue for a long time. Resource plundering in Africa has destabilized ecosystems, has destabilized especially livelihoods of women who are closest to the environment. And you can see the current crisis now of climate change crisis. African women disproportionately continue to bear the brunt of climate shocks, which whether it's water scarcity, food insecurity, displacement, right? Gender-based violence, especially in spaces where, like, we have places in northern Kenya. We are so glad now it's raining, but for a long time, when there is drought, young girls are forced into forced child marriages. Research has already shown and proven there's increased sexual violence, there's increased FGM, female genital cutting of girls, so that they can be quickly married off as young brides, and then hopefully the family can be able to replenish their stocks after the drought. So you can see African women and girls disproportionately bear the brunt of climate shocks. And what's happening when it comes to payment of climate shocks? Very few people are thinking about climate justice as a form of gendering climate justice. So in terms of reparations, we demand, and we hope we can start thinking through climate justice, gendering of climate justice funds, ecological restoration, again, thinking through what is ecological justice and an ecologically gendered justice for women, which includes women-led adaptation initiatives and also women-led supporting women's adaptation, women's resilience, and also vulnerabilities, making sure that mitigating the vulnerabilities, like these girls who are often quickly married off after FGM to replenish stocks and that kind of thing. So last, the issue of reparations, I mean, extractivism, again, in natural resources, agribusiness, and you know what's going on in DRC. Mining continues again to replicate colonial extraction patterns. And so the gendered impact of this, of course, the violence, health risks, and displacement that disproportionately affects women. And through this initiative, we are asking or demanding reparations that then end exploitative contracts that don't think through, again, gender justice for women, that contracts that also don't ensure the sovereignty of local communities, contracts that also don't ensure gender justice in economics, so sustainable economies that put care ethics in the center, especially for women. And I think we can't belabor the point, looking at what is going on or what has been going on in DRC, mining and exploitation of women going side by side. So a gender justice reparations framework calls for more imagining and rethinking what would these contracts look like, what would a more just system of extractives and sustainable economies and mining look like. So just to close, is to say that colonial gendered violence did not vanish. It persists, as we've said, in unpaid care work, in climate justice initiatives that don't center gender justice as the core, in extractive industries that continue to plunder our lands and again don't center a gendered justice ecological framework. So reparations then must not be tokenist, they must not be charity, they should be transformative, and they should be transformative in a gendered way. And that's why we are here. So we are calling for redistributing, recognizing, restoring, and an ethics of care that looks at not just the individuals, the community, and the environment, so that African women and the communities can thrive in dignity and in justice. And I submit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Njoki, for that. I mean, it's very interesting to listen to you and hear how women's bodies and labors were sites of colonial violence and sites of labor extraction. And the fact that in the current neoliberal reforms, it continues to happen, either in the ways of unpaid care work, like you have exhaustively explained to us, or in terms of extractive industries and how states in Africa, consume themselves within these systems in the name of economic development for Africa, in the name of progress, but also ignoring how these systems continue to engender women's lives, to strengthen inequalities in ways that are not easily seen, except if interrogated. And thank you, we're picking some of the proposals that you have made. Thank you so much for that presentation. So thank you everyone for introducing yourselves in the chat. And I'm seeing we have a number of countries in Africa that are represented here: Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Sudan, Zambia, Uganda, Ghana. We also have colleagues from the other part of the world: France, Canada, Berlin, Ireland, Netherlands, and Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, if you've not introduced yourself, please do that. Yes, Democratic Republic of Congo. And, please write where you're joining us from so you can be acknowledged. Thank you, Njoki. And very quickly, I'm moving on to our next speaker, who is Panashe Chigumadzi. speaking to us about the African Union framework on reparations. When I started off, I gave us a short overview of how this conversation around reparation has been reignited by the African Union and why it is important for us to engage with this, because African Union, after declaring the year 2025 as the year for reparations for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, they declared 2025 to 2035 as the decade of reparations. So confirming and reaffirming their commitment to continuing this conversation for another decade, I think is something that we need to leverage on. So Panashe is going to be speaking to us about the African Union Framework on Reparations, examining the intersection of state-led reparations, gendered colonial harm, and decolonial Pan-African feminist demands. Panashe, you're welcome. You can speak a bit about who you are, just for participants to get that. Thank you so much. You have the floor. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Helen. That was a really wonderful introduction, and it's really wonderful to be in communion with you all today, with my fellow panelists, and of course to the wonderful collective that has created this position paper. And power, I suppose, is a Freudian slip because it is speaking to the power of Black women and their intellect, and them really leading the reparations charge, as you'll see in what I speak to, with a little bit of this framework. And as we've mentioned earlier, I serve as the rapporteur for the AU Committee of Experts for reparations on slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. We have not yet published or adopted fully the reparations framework. However, this is just to give you an indication about some of the thinking behind this. Is something that I've been working on for the last month or so. And just really, of course, long before I joined the Committee of Experts, which was recently constituted in December, so our work is very new. We're all part of civil society, first and foremost, and you will hear in this, in my remarks, this is really part of a 6th century Africana reparations movement that long precedes the even formation of the AU. The AU joins a long lineage of this work that really works across Africa and its diaspora. And it's quite important to note that the AU has 6 regions, the 6th region being the diasporas. And that's really important in terms of anchoring how we're going to think about this question of reparations and thinking about what it means to fundamentally end the world. It's not a question of inclusion within a dying world order as we know it. Rather, it is about fundamentally reimagining the world. And in order to do so, it is about a historic imagination of the future. So with that, I will begin my remarks. First and foremost, today in my capacity, I speak as a scholar and a historian, and I bring into the framework there, but that's the capacity that I speak in first and foremost. So do not take what I say to be official AU dogma as I come and speak to you today. The first thing, if there's nothing that you remember from today's remarks for myself, it is this, which is akuko zinyane lemvubu ladliwa zingwenya kwaceba iziziba. For those of you who speak isiZulu, you might hazard some translations for us. But essentially, this means it never happens that the hippo's calf is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. There must be consequences. And why this is quite important in anchoring how we think from a Black feminist or African feminist perspective on reparations is moving from a way in which we have historically thought of Ubuntu and African-centered modes of restorative justice and transitional justice being through the lens of the Christianized Ubuntu framework that was popularized with the TRC. This is a radical Black feminist Ubuntu that says and that demands reparations for harm that is done. It is not about a biological motherhood, rather the hippo's mother in this instance. As Africans, we understand that if harm, because we are through those who come with us, those who come after us, those who come before us, we understand that a harm to one is a harm to us all, and therefore we have the sovereign right to defend ourselves and to demand reparations for that harm. And that's the basis of how we think about this from an African feminist basis of reparations. In particular, those of you who seek Setswana, for example, or Sepedi, we know that it is said, "Mangwana utswara tipa ka bogaleng," the mother of the child holds the knife by its edge. So it's quite interesting if we understand and base ourselves and anchor ourselves in our own indigenous conceptions. There's a running and a through line of mothers, and again, not biological motherhood, because we know that in our own conceptions of personhood are not based on biology, but about our social relations. Motherhood necessarily means and entails the defense of us, and we have the right to defend ourselves on the basis of our sovereignty. And the reason why I mentioned this question of sovereignty, it is absolutely central to understanding what this reparations conversation is about. It is not a plea for inclusion. It is not a plea to be recognized. It is about asserting the sovereignty of African being and personhood in the world, because that is really what is at the core of the crime that has been done to us. And the name of the AU framework, which I drafted and conceptualized, is namely "A Crime Does Not Rot." 1444 to present, the AU framework for reparations for slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. And where that particular idea comes from, the idea of a crime does not rot. In Xhosa, we speak about Icala Aliboli. In Shona, we speak of Moshaiwori. If you speak in Setswana or Sepedi, we say Mulata Ayoboli. And the idea being that because our conceptions of personhood are not only relational, they're intergenerational, the idea is that crimes will have intergenerational consequences. And a crime does not rot. Time cannot wash away a crime until there is reparations. And that then already immediately, from an African perspective, addresses the central stumbling block to the reparations discourse, particularly post-Durban and even with 1993 Abuja Proclamation, is the idea of so-called retrospectivity or retroactivity, the idea that there's a so-called statute of limitations for crimes that have been done. We know that according to our own Pan-African legal principles, particularly this idea of a crime not rotting, there is no statute of limitations for a crime until there is reparations. And that is the core of how we're anchoring that this must be a reparations agenda that is based in the sovereignty and the assertion of the sovereignty of our being and our own knowledge systems. We are not discovering new rights. And as we see with this framework, why we start with 1444, and this is quite important in terms of how we conceptualize what the crime is. The crime does not start with the scramble for Africa after the Berlin Conference. The crime against us as African peoples that begins with the inception of the trafficking in enslaved African people, the chattelization or the racialized chattelization really begins in 1444. And that moment when the Portuguese first kidnapped the first set of Africans and have the first state or public state auction of African people, in particular African mothers who were separated from their children, is the beginning of this crime, a world-breaking crime as we define it, because fundamentally this had never happened in the world before, where a group of people were reduced to the status of chattel property and as a legal alienable property, and in particular, Black women's wombs were at the heart of the status of property. If you see laws, for example, like Parta Sequitur Vintrum, which came about in 1662, the idea is that Black women confer the status of enslavement. No other woman's wombs give that status of property across the world. If, for example, an enslaved man impregnated a white woman, that child would not be considered a slave. It is Black women's wombs which created that status of property. So in addition to being sites of violence, sites of labor, we are the womb of the world that was created by racialized chattel enslavement. And what is very important in us understanding why we define this as a world-breaking and a world-redefining crime is that the beginnings of racialized chattel enslavement marked the end of feudalism and marked the rise of what we now know as the modern world racial capitalist system. All of the logics that we now are imprisoned by began at that particular moment. And so when we think about what happens to women on the African continent, we must place it in that longue durée. And in particular, with this framework, it is helping us understand and move beyond some of the more liberal understandings of discrimination and racism, inequality, and understanding what is specific about what happened to African people. The idea that we have been reduced to property and sites of capital accumulation. That is what we were designated as, whether we went through the Middle Passage or through the trade going through the Indian Ocean, or those of us who remained on the African continent. Slavery fundamentally structured the development of all regions across the world, and those of us on the continent in particular. And what does that mean in concrete terms? Because it can sound quite abstract. For example, it is very often, and I'll just use this example that makes it a little bit clearer, we will often hear the idea that Israeli apartheid is worse than South African apartheid. And that really speaks to a fundamental misunderstanding around how the logics and the property logics of transatlantic slavery continue to structure the world. And what do I mean by that? The relationship of a state when it comes to Black people is never a logic of elimination. It is a reproductive logic which requires Black bodies to reproduce the state. So it is never in the interest of a state to eliminate entirely, even if it is a settler state, to eliminate a Black population, because we are required for the reproduction of society. In the Southern African case, for example, many of us would know that there is the migrant labor system. And the idea there was the idea that our mothers and grandmothers were then consigned to native reserves where their unpaid reproductive labor subsidized the profits of mining labor, farming labor that did not pay African men family wages. So you can afford not to pay men at the same level of wages that white workers would have because Black women's unpaid reproductive labor is subsidizing those profits. That's one way we see very concretely the ways in which transatlantic slavery's logics continue to shape the development of the African continent beyond the question of depopulation. It definitely informs the question of structural planning, structural development of the continent. As we know, for example, the mining industry in Southern Africa was directly modeled on Brazilian slave mining after the end of abolition. So it's quite important to think about how transatlantic slavery fundamentally transformed at a structural level beyond simply the question of the quantity, the violence, and the duration of it. It is about how it fundamentally altered the world structure as we know it. There's no group of people who were left untouched by the system. In Asia, for example, that's why we see the rise of indentured labor. It was built on the model of enslavement. So once there was no longer slavery, we needed to see the rise of indentured labor, and as well as the fact that the colonization of Asia was built on the venture capital and the profits for transatlantic slavery. That is what subsidized that trade. In the face of Europe, for example, it's the Industrial Revolution. It is all of those different systems that come from transatlantic slavery. And we speak to how, for example, the climate crisis is as a result of the plantation logics, where we move from having polycultures, indigenous stewardship, to monocultures and industrial or plantation-based industrialization. So if we think about the climate crisis, it's not beginning with the 18th century industrial revolution. It begins all the way in the 15th century, 1444. And this is really important for us to understand, because very often when we have our various reparations discourses, we tend to speak in the silos. I speak about what is happening to me on the African continent, what has happened to Africans in the diaspora, but these things must be understood in that historical continuum. There would be no scramble for Africa. The Africans who were stolen from their lands in the 15th century are directly connected to the Africans whose lands were stolen from them once there was the end of abolition. So that's really important. And why that becomes important when we think about a world building resolution is that there is no kind of, and any real reparations discourse cannot have an inclusionary logics. It fundamentally has to break up those property logics that were inaugurated in 1444. This is why we go and return to this idea of an unrotting crime. The crime is still fresh because it is compounding. If you look at people like Saul Blakey, who write about this idea of a crime does not rot, you say you cannot only think about our fathers' debts. We also speak about that those cattle that our fathers had also then have interest. Those cattle have children, or those cattle have calves. The idea being that there is unjust enrichment. The crime continues to compound with neoliberalism and the current global financial architecture, which begins in 1444. So now what does that mean for us in thinking at a state-centric level? Of course, there are an incredible amount of limitations in thinking about the state-centric level because, as we know, the Westphalian system is very much a system that is embedded with transatlantic slavery going back to 1492, who is recognized as sovereign and who's recognized as non-sovereign. And that's really important in particular because what we see, for example, in many of the various reparations cases, for example, the Mau Mau case, even looking at the Nama and Herero genocide, when it comes to Africans, we have what I call an Africa exception. Other groups of people are given reparations. Let's say it's the Jewish case, let's say it's the Japanese case, because they're recognized as sovereign peoples. Africans, for example, the Mau Mau case, there's always a caveat that is not recognizing liability. There's no apology. In the German case, they specifically say it is about development aid, and it is not, at some point, they denied calling it a genocide because this is about recognizing that Africans continue to be understood as property. This is why when Haiti asked for or demanded reparations all the way in the 2000s in recognition of the 1815 indemnity that they were forced to pay, billions for the loss of French property. The idea is that property cannot ask for its own value. So this is what we must recognize here, that we as Africans across Africa and the diaspora and the continent itself continue to be seen as a site of capital accumulation. And at the heart of that is our wombs as Black women. We are the wombs of this modern world racial capitalist system. So what does that mean at a state-centric level? I know we have to finish off very quickly. What we have to understand, one, in the framework, what we do make sure we lay out is that there's a 6th century history and tradition of Africans litigating this case of reparations. No other group of people has ever had to litigate a case for this long. And that is really established from 1444. So it's a contemporaneous tradition that we have. And this tradition then is picked up in the 1990s by the Abuja Proclamation and going all the way to Durban, which is really the 25th anniversary is this year. And Durban is seen as a really important moment because it's the first time that the multilateral systems then recognize that slavery was and is a crime against humanity. Or rather, there's the caveat, should have been at the time, again, invoking the idea of intertemporal law or non-retrospect or non-retroactivity. But why Durban is quite important is that that was civil society action had brought that into play, and it was African heads of state who failed to support the diaspora. This is why Hilary Beckles has called it previously the Great African Betrayal. Of course, we're now 25 years later, we see a different idea where states are actually moving in consensus. We just see that the African Union has supported Ghana's resolution calling the transatlantic slave trade, or rather the trafficking in racialized enslaved African people or racialized chattelized African peoples as the greatest crime against humanity. But this tells us that we cannot stop putting their feet to the fire. There is only so far as state-centric approaches are going to lead us in this. We have to continue understanding that this is fundamentally a civil society-owned movement that is more than 6 centuries long. Why the state-centric aspect does become important to engage is that this question of reparations, if we understand this as fundamentally a question of power and geopolitics, when we understand that slavery, colonialism, and apartheid are about a modern world racial capitalist system, we have to understand that we have to move from a question of moral suasion, because we know that no moment in our history have we ever had our freedom handed to us on the basis of moral suasion. It has always been when we were ungovernable and it was no longer profitable. So for us, it means that we need to look at a point of sovereign cost imposition, that the cost of non-compliance has to be higher than the cost of continuing with the current conditions. And one of the key levers, and some of the key levers are in the state's hands. And part of those key aspects is, for example, resource sovereignty. 30% of known minerals for the just transition are specifically located in Africa. What if Africa says, if you do not repair in these particular ways, a fundamental shift and a break in the world economic structure, you will not have access to these resources. That now is, of course, subject to what states will and will not do. It's a question of political power, but it's important for us to have that paradigm shift that this is a question of sovereignty, and we must think about how do we impose costs for non-compliance with this, as opposed to continually litigate this as a moral case. The moral case is indisputable. We understand this. However, it is now a question of sovereign cost imposition, and that's where I'll leave this here. And part of this, in terms of ensuring sovereign cost imposition, this is about how we hold our states to the fire. If they are signing deals that underhand us as Africans and sell us down the road, if we have more RUD concessions, this is how we hold them accountable. And so I'm really excited to hear more the presentation of the paper, which is really wonderful. It's really important that we continue to engage and to continue to really hold our states to the fire, because the only reason that this has reached the AU is because of the work that civil society has done. And so we continue to do this, and I'm really proud of the work that African feminists are doing to ensure that we have this agenda put forth.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, I'm not going to dilute the presentation by trying to summarize, but I walk away from this presentation with one message. African feminist perspective must demand reparations for the harm that was done based on sovereignty. You've given us the history, everything, the state-centric nature of what we're experiencing, but most importantly, the role of civil society and feminist activists, academia, in terms of defining, what this transformative agenda should be looking at. So thank you so much. And we thank you for that space of, I want to hear what you have to say. So we are very happy that AFIP Collective's paper is going to at least be feeding into something. So allow me, dear participants, to invite Professor Toni Haastrup to present the AFIP paper. Toni, you have the floor.
Toni, do you mind for 2 seconds? The one thing I did want to add was just, and it's an important question just that was added in the Q&A, part of doing that history and historicization, because often we think Africans do too much talking, too much historicizing, they must just do. I'm also a military historian, and just doing without thinking and reconnaissance is a suicide mission. And it's important when we ask about the question of complicity, there's a long history of state-led resistance to enslavement. People like Njoki, for example, people like King Alfonso, so many people, and this is part and parcel, as well as the actual military resistance. There's also legal resistance that is documented in the framework. So it's important that we understand that it's not just a question of Africans selling each other, but also more important, if you understand this structurally, there is no system of oppression that does not recruit and employ the victim group. Whether it is capitalism, we have workers who will defend billionaires, whether it is Nazism, we had Jewish people who were part of that system. That is always par for the course in any oppressive system, because it is totalizing. So that is just a response to the question of complicity. Yes, there were Africans who were part of it, but they were also structurally vulnerable. That's why we have kings who then became enslaved people. That does not dilute the question of reparations and the rightness of that demand.
Yeah, thank you so much. More questions in the chat, please put it there and we're going to come back to it. Thank you so much, Panashe, for responding to that immediately. The conversations continue. Toni, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Helen, and good morning, good evening to those who are on this call with us. I don't want to take too much time because I think that there's a lot of appetite for discussion, and frankly, it's very difficult to follow Njoki and Panashe. But what I want to try to do is give you a bit of a snapshot of this position paper from AFIP. And I think actually I've come at the right time, because you'll see how we try to sort of combine those the demands that come outside of formalized institutions like states or the regional organizations, from civil society, to then inform how states and regional organizations can begin to work for the people that they ostensibly represent. So I think, in a sense, our sort of Pan-Africanist feminist approach to reparations is, as Helen said, really a demand. And in that sense, then, we decided against other forms of sort of knowledge product and focused instead on a position paper. And part of that is that we're suggesting that Black feminism is very broad, and actually working in solidarity with a lot of other movements, there will be new things added on to the ways in which we can and should go about making a lot of these demands. So this paper is just a Pan-Africanist feminist approach to reparations, not the only. And what it tries to do is advocate for sort of a comprehensive, transformative, and, in terms of concepts that we're familiar with, an intersectional feminist framework for reparations for Africa. And again, when we sort of think of Africa, very much in the idea that Panashe has try to elaborate, we're sort of thinking in broader terms, sort of rooted again in that Pan-Africanism, thinking about reparations from the perspective of just folks of Afro descent in general. And the focus is on trying to address both the historical injustices, in the assumption that those historical injustices persist and that those harms are intergenerational, and that there are ongoing systemic oppressions that need to be addressed in order for us to build any sort of just future. And I think this conversation comes at an important time. Last month, there was a speech at Davos that was given by the Canadian Prime Minister, where he questions, I think for the first time publicly, that a sort of global minority leader would question the fundaments of a rule-based international order. So we hear about the rule-based international order all of the time, and that's the thing that we should ascribe to, that's the thing that we should preserve. And here he sort of tries to create a sort of intervention. Now, I think it was really great that we had that at that level, but it was also a bit frustrating because sort of a very tiny bit of what he said is a tiny bit of what African feminists and other Pan-Africanists have been saying for centuries, again, as Panashe describes. So I think first, one of the things that the paper tries to think through is sort of take a very holistic, a systemic approach to this issue situated within contemporary international politics. First, the paper seeks to think through reparations beyond financial compensation. And hopefully, in the discussions that we've had so far, you see why that is very important. A broad understanding of reparations includes structural transformation, emphasizes redress, and seeks to dismantle interconnected systems of oppression that have persisted over time. And that includes patriarchy, capitalism, racism, imperialism, and seeks to emphasize relational accountability and collective well-being. And here's where I see the sort of feminist intervention being very important. What we found out engaging with both contemporary and historical feminists is that African feminist epistemologies, which have tended to highlight intersectionality and relational accountability, must be part and parcel of whatever big framework that emerges from states and regional organizations, particularly those who are acting on behalf of African citizens. Historically, however, what we've tended to see is proposals tend to exclude gendered harms, tend not to focus on things that they see as existing very much at the state sort of national grassroots level, like issues around land dispossession and indeed ecological degradation. And yet we know by looking at the patterns of international relations, by looking at the exploitative nature of neoliberalism and indeed racial capitalism over time, that these things continue to be fundamental, as has been expressed by my colleagues. So, what the paper calls for is more of an inclusive, transformative understanding and transformative agenda towards reparations, aligned with what we would consider to be a Pan-Africanist, decolonial, feminist vision of the world. We've heard how colonialism has structured the way in which things work, how imperialism has structured it, how the transatlantic slave trade continues to underpin the international system within which we work. But I think it's also important to emphasize that these colonial regimes have imposed, for us anyway, hierarchical gender roles that tend to erase and diminish African women's perspectives and their roles. So it's not that African women are not present, but what they sort of contribute at sort of that higher level of knowledge making, as well as the ways in which they could contribute to governance in general, is often diminished. And this diminishing happens within our own societies, in the context of state institutions, and certainly in the international context. And it has happened through, as Njoki was talking about, sexual exploitation, reproductive coercion, but just the general diminishing of the role that social reproduction plays in advancing the sort of economies that tend to be valued. So it is the case that contemporary neoliberal globalization, extractive industries, and environmental destruction in contemporary terms have exacerbated colonial legacies. And this has impacted women, but also other gender minorities. So invariably, a feminist framework for reparative justice must confront these issues. Reparations must be multidimensional. They must address historical and ongoing harms. And I think that this is really important. I agree completely with Panashe that we cannot separate something that is history and something that is contemporary. If we look at our world today, whether focusing on what the indebtedness to Africans and Afro-descent people, or more generally, that dichotomy just does not make sense. But I think beyond simply recognizing that the dichotomy between what is historical and what is contemporary should not be ignored, we also have to then think in practice, what can this mean? What can a feminist approach actually mean in practice? And for us, that means that whatever interventions or whatever proposals end up in both national and international frameworks, they must be participatory. They must engender a participatory process. Often, a lot of governance issues tend to be top down. And even where we see those working at sort of the grassroots level feeding into a lot of these mechanisms, their voices tend to be ignored. But I think, again, in order to legitimize those institutions that are ostensibly working on behalf of Africans to the ends of reparation, then those folks who are being represented must understand and must feel like they are feeding into that process. Invariably, there has to be a redistribution of power and resources, which is often quite centralized. And for us, that means dismantling, as I said, patriarchal norms so that there can be more equitable divisions. Economic justice must be at the heart of this redistribution strategies, and that means valuing unpaid labor and establishing reparation funds as a sort of practical means to ensuring that this works. But it also means, and we've sort of seen this conversation happening in the diaspora beyond the continent, investing in public care infrastructures. We need to take seriously the gendered sexual-based harms that have been inflicted on African and Afro-descendant women across the world, so that we need to sort of center the experiences of these women, the violences that they've experienced, as being at the heart of any reparations conversation and struggle. We also highlighted in the paper the importance of education and knowledge systems. By and large, in the context of doing this research, a lot of our populations do not understand the history that has led us to where we are, despite experiencing the negative impacts of that. And for us, this requires a reinvestment in education, a reinvestment in indigenous knowledge systems, in traditional practices. And here we think that language is very crucial. The conversation that is going on in higher education institutions on the continent beyond. We know, for example, that women have historically been the custodians of resistance, and therefore they harbor the cultural knowledge, and this is why they must be engaged consistently throughout this process. Justice has to, rather, education is a tool for justice, and it's also a tool for cultural preservation. We've already heard about the implications of environmental degradation, and this continued to happen. Ecological harms, including polluted water, deforestation, soil degradation, and just the general battering of the ecosystem which we depend on for our livelihoods, are consistently being degraded in the name of economic progress, and in a lot of respects by some of our own governments as well. And so conversations about green transitions, conversations about climate change are not just peripheral, but rather quite central to whatever we want in terms of reparations. As I said, I don't want to take too long, but I think it is worth highlighting that, as my co-panelists have suggested, throughout this period, there has been a consistent leadership of African women, of African feminists, even if they are not acknowledged as such. And I think it is time to actually recognize the impact that they have had on the emancipatory and liberatory dimensions and opportunities in governance. And this is important because when it comes to actually operationalizing and implementing the strategies for reparations, their roles are going to be very significant. You will need women and you will need feminists to sort of help carry the message of what this could look in practice in communities, within countries, and transnationally. So for us, thinking in policy terms, key actions that we think is needed include complete policy integration, data collection, monitoring, sort of feminist monitoring and accountability, and indeed public awareness. That means that we need to integrate sort of these feminist perspectives into existing frameworks, for example, Agenda 2063. We need to invest more in African feminist research and indigenous methodologies. We need to create independent bodies that include feminists to undertake some of this monitoring work. And we believe that this cannot simply be left to the level of the elites. And I use the word elites in a sort of comprehensive way. So yes, here we are representing civil society to a large extent, but we still feed into the elites because we get the space to engage in a lot of spaces that the majority of the African population do not get to. And as such, then, we believe that there is a necessity for a continent-wide awareness campaign that makes use of contemporary tools, of media, of art, and indeed the art of storytelling. So let me finish by saying that to think about reparations through this feminist lens is reimagining justice as collective and potentially transformative. We believe then that reparations should be part of a broader solidarity movement, emphasizing community building, healing, and seen as a process of ongoing justice, not simply an event. We need to focus on restoring dignity in this process, emphasize rights, particularly rights of those who are the most marginalized, those who are consistently minoritized. We believe that in order to be able to do this effectively, we must build alliances globally that amplifies African feminist perspectives, because those perspectives do not just rest on the continent, but are very much feed into diaspora discourses. But let me end by saying, and to echo Njoki and Panashe, reparations are indeed a moral imperative, but they are also the path towards a liberatory future. And indeed, this framework that we're proposing, we believe, can help us sort of shift the needle, shift the discourse a bit from sort of thinking that reparations is about punishment, but really thinking about it in restorative and community centered ways of thinking about justice. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Toni. I mean, you responded to all the issues that Njoki raised. You responded to all the issues that Panashe raised, in terms of looking at it from a historical perspective, but bringing it to contemporary issues. And things have really not changed. They are just being done in different ways and named differently. But basically, the foundation and the approaches to what we are experiencing today remains the same. You've called out what we want as AFIP Collective: economic justice and redistribution of power and resources, addressing gendered and sexuality specific harms, and all the other harms. And the way Panashe put it, let us not talk about 1960s. It has to go back to 1444, when slave trade started. That is when the harm started. So you also brought it down to, in terms of education and knowledge systems, and how these are rooted within colonialism, and how we see the structures of access to education today, and ecological reparations, public representation of women and leadership. But also you made, concrete proposed strategies that you think we should be looking at. African feminist knowledge generation, should be grounded on that. And we shouldn't just look at financial reparations. You talk about care infrastructure that we should be looking at. So it's a lot of proposals that have been made, and I'm sure Panashe has been taking notes. Of course, we give you a copy of the paper, in terms of this, and we are open to more conversations on this. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but I would like you to take 5 minutes, for example, 3 of you, to respond to anything and you think someone said, and just 5 minutes, and then we can come back to the chat. Yeah, so who wants to go first?
I would just like to first, once again, just congratulate us on such a wonderful initiative, because again, it is Black women. And I say Black women because of the long durée of what binds us on the African diaspora and the African continent, and always being racialized. And that's really important to always remember with that. And that intellectual leadership is important, particularly because part of the justification for us as enslavable is us as non-reasoning beings, non-rational beings. That's also quite important. And that's part of the assertion of sovereignty. Quite honestly, if we understand this in its true sense at a realpolitik level, there is no European or Western country that is ever going to give us what we need on a silver platter, because most and all of the transformative work is going to come from us. It is about that assertion of sovereignty, and this intellectual sovereignty is very, very important for us. We need to define the terms of what reparations is going to look like. Having that world-making project is really important. So I really want to congratulate you as Black women leading that particular effort. And in that regard, I also want to just give another aspect around what we mean by reparations is not just a check, because we also know that reparations, there is no check that will ever be commensurate with the kind of harm that is ongoing and historic. It is always going to be something, a check will not sort out a system, or a check does not end a structure. So that's really important for us to understand. But one important aspect that is really undervalued is Black people, not just as bodies of capital, bodies of labor, but also the actual and literal bodies of knowledge. We're talking about the education system. Quite important to how when we talk about Black women's wombs as the womb of the world, Europe does not know itself without our bodies. So what do I mean by that in concrete terms? From Sarah Baartman to women with thinking about Henrietta Lacks, to the Black women who were experimented upon and tortured to create what we now know as gynecology. It has been our bodies who have literally been the sites of knowledge to create what we now know as Western science. So that's part of what we need to think and understand. When we think about the Nama Herero genocide, it was our bodies that were used to experiment upon for German universities. So in thinking about that holistic level, the world cannot survive our reparations demands. The world as we know it must end for us to have a true world remaking project. So that's quite important in just spotlighting the importance of us taking our intellectual work seriously, because our bodies and our reduction to bodies is central not just to the capital accumulation, but also the knowledge accumulation that Europe has. And there's a reason I often think about the Harvards and your Cambridge. They keep our ancestors' brains and their bodies and bones in those institutions. If it didn't mean anything, why don't you give it back? Because it's quite important to their own metaphysical well-being and understanding of themselves. So it's quite important that it's both material and metaphysically. There is no world as we know it without the bodies of Black people and Black women in particular.
Thank you so much, Panashe, for bringing up that. And I think it's very important that we continue to interrogate, these perspectives for us to really be able to say, what does a transformative feminist reparation then looks like? Thanks so much. Anybody wants to say anything? I have a few questions in the chat. I feel like reading them out while we are having this conversation. I see Nancy responding, but I will still read the question. I like Teddy Atim from Uganda, because I know her, says, I like your mention of the elite. My observation is that the women's movement, to some extent, suffers from elite capture. They are mainly capital city based and disconnected from women's groups at the grassroots, yet most affected by harms and whose experiences would inform reparation demands. How do we make sure that the discourses and efforts on reparation reflect the reality of women who are most affected or disconnected from power centers? There's a second question. So Njoki was trying to respond, so maybe she can build on that. But there's a second question that says, thank you so much for these amazing presentations. I wanted to ask the following. Taking inspiration from the reparations framework and what you shared on African feminist perspectives, when Latin American states recognize care as a human right and propose its redistribution among the state, market, family, and community, do these policies dismantle the colonial, racial, and gendered hierarchies that have historically structured care labor? Or do they merely reconfigure the management and circulation of feminized and racial labor within neoliberal governance? That's so interesting. I was also wondering about that. That's so interesting. Thank you so much, Paulina, for that question. And lastly, Wumi says, thank you all for organizing the meeting and for such brilliant, informative presentations. I would like to ask if at all the concept of apology is incorporated into the demands for reparation. I think we could start from that. Such an apology could help in convincing folks who think Africa keeps blaming the past when the present current state powers is terrible. Current state powers is terrible. I've missed a bit of it because that indeed a reparable harm was occasioned to Africans and people of African descent. So there's been this debate, Panashe and Njoki, about, should we start from apology? I see Lebonhan has joined us. Lebonhan, welcome from your webinar. I was also at your webinar. Reparations must be understood not only as financial compensation, but as a restoration of stolen time and knowledge. Colonialism and patriarchy did not merely extract land and labor, they appropriated generations, compressing life into forced productivity, seizing reproductive labor, and enclosing. I think is a comment. So what I can do, Lebonha, is to allow the speakers to respond to the questions, and I invite you to speak about, this thing about stolen time, because it was very interesting to hear you speak about it a few minutes ago. So who wants to take on the questions? Njoki, you had started with
Yes.
the issue of daylight, and then Panashe and Toni can then speak to the question from Paulina, and then we can invite Lebonha to speak a bit about time, the stolen time. Yeah. Over to you, Njoki.
I have a response to time, which is why we have a crime does not rot, because that precisely is speaking to the question of temporal sovereignty. Who defines the time of justice in the very
Yeah.
first place? I'm really glad that she brought that up, and we can talk about that.
All right. Okay, good. Okay, Njoki, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, my sister Helen. And thank you, Toni. Also, just to also recognize, Toni did a lot of work in this and thank you for the work that you put in, as much as we also supported you as a collective. I just wanted to respond, yes. Also to the question somebody was asking before I come to the issue of elite versus grassroots and that kind of thing. And I will answer it through thinking through two things: intersectional feminist reparations, which I think we have captured in the position paper, and also a decolonial approach to feminist reparations. So if we think through those two, if we think using the lens of the two, decolonial and intersectional, and then it then captures those concerns, even this gap of the elite versus the grassroots. And if we think through a decolonial and an intersectional feminist approach to reparations, which we often don't, I totally agree. And that's why then people see that divide of these elite women are sitting in AU or wherever. Are they really capturing? And so it means we need to think through first, what does a decolonial and both a decolonial and intersectional feminist approach look like? One, I would say we need to think through epistemic injustices. Where is knowledge? The idea of where is knowledge? Who has knowledge? Yes, I mean, and I acknowledge our privilege as very privileged women in the collective who developed this. But then how then do we recognize African women's knowledges, whether it's oral history, and those people who study history like Panashe. I study transitional justice. We know, if you interview even ordinary women, ordinary people, they know through oral traditions. Each of us, those ideas of what is personhood, our African philosophies captured in all our proverbs and stories. So if we speak through those, if we tap into those, there's a lot of knowledge there on what is healing, what is justice. One thing I was reading just the other day, my own language, Gikuyu, ethics. And one thing I absolutely loved about, somebody captured it in a book and she died, Kenoti, Professor Kenoti, an African woman. And she captured the idea of justice as very important to us. It's part of our ethic. And it's called Kihoto in Kikuyu, Kihoto. And so it's not just justice as something that is what was interesting is not justice as a concept, but also justice as a verb, that is in with other people. Yes, because you do an injustice to the people. But you know what happens when we talk about justice in the Western liberal sense? It's like injustice to the state. The harm is often to the state. And so we forget the people who are harmed, and so we don't take, and that's why we're talking about also what restorative justice, healing, and doing the healing work, and the memory, questions of memory, our memories. Often, like I like this, what we are saying. If you look at even the big injustices that have been done to Black people, whether it's that 1444 from slavery to now, even when the West or whoever, or this, what are they called, MNCs, multinational corporations, will come and sometimes once in a while apologize. Like you remember even the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, or the Mau Mau case, which I was quite involved in. They will give an apology, but it is a general apology, and of course an apology to men, given the status of women. So also I think as AFIP, we need to start demanding very specific apologies for women, and then that way we'll be talking about also in just don't just apologize and say, oh yes, what we did. Like you remember when even Belgium apologized to Congo. What about the women? Yes, you apologize to the family of Lumumba. What about all the women? So we need to start asking for also and so the idea of apology, but again, and beyond apology has to go on with, as we are saying, epistemic reparations, our knowledges, and placing those knowledges as part of the knowledge that then informs even reparations at, gendered reparations, not just at national levels, at the AU level, or at those people who we are demanding reparations for. And of course, if it's epistemic, it calls for, like the work we are doing right now as AFIP, whether it's disposition papers, more research, and also more documenting, as I'm saying, our ordinary women, so that we don't have this grassroots versus, because those people know a lot. And if we're going to really locate and center decolonial feminist reparations that are intersectional, that's where we start from. And I stop at that, Helen.
Thank you so much, Toni.
Yes, no, thank you so much. Perhaps to pick up from Njoki and then try to address, I think it was Paulina's question. I think from our perspective, and I think you kind of have to read the paper as a whole, the key element that I want to highlight is that this feminist approach to reparations is undergirded by the idea, like Njoki said, that knowledges happen across the entire ecosystem, whether you're in what might be categorized as a village versus whether you're in a town versus a city. And in a sense, a lot of the dichotomies that we tend to see between city versus non-city has come about because of all of this hierarchies that exist, whether it's patriarchy, capitalism itself that sort of makes those separations, geographies. And actually recognizing that means that we would put more work into ensuring that no type of knowledge is diminished. It also means that we will use wherever position we are situated to further that broader goal. So it will be the case that only some of us will be able to access the AU. I'm an academic. I don't have the access that Panashe necessarily has, because that is not necessarily in the context of my job at the moment. But I am happy that those feminist engagements and articulations that we've had here will get into that conversation precisely because she's there. So I think that one of the things I hope we're able to do with this conversation is really sort of erasing those lines as being so rigid and ensuring that in our sort of acceptance that we all have to do more, that we are intentional in the ways in which we engage those who might not be in the same spaces as us, and in the ways in which we sort of think about whose knowledge counts. And I think this actually does link to Paulina's question around K. I suspect, yes, indeed, it might be the case that when states take on care as a human rights, none of those terms are neutral. Care, human rights itself, none of those terms are neutral, and it always goes back to, but who is it that you're talking about? It might very well be the case that it kind of pans out in the way that you've explained. But I don't think that that is the only pathway, because when we sort of think about the way that care as an idea of human rights even came to the discourse of a lot of Latin American countries, then we would go to the grassroots, we will go to the favelas, and we will go to the communities. In Africa, it's community groups in Sudan that are thinking about care as a way to sort of maintain their liberation, their peace, and their security. So I think we can't necessarily always think of some of these ideas as in a binary sense. And I guess this is kind of where the sort of decolonial Pan-Africanist feminism comes in. It really tries to challenge this idea of the binary. We have to work from where we're at. And I do think that it is quite possible that a state, for example, despite all of its constraints, if it does take seriously that feminist knowledge, but importantly, that feminist praxis of what is already happening with respect to care in neighborhoods in Mexico, in neighborhoods in the Sudan, then it doesn't have to be exploitative. But I guess that is where the accountability and monitoring also come in. I'll pass on to Panashe and Lebohang to talk a bit about the time.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, Panashe.
Thank you. This is really wonderful, this discussion of this. And I think I'll just make a few brief comments beyond just then getting to this question of this as a world building project that understands that this is more than just, and there's no amount of money that can repair if we do not get to the structural dimensions of this, because transatlantic slavery initiated a world breaking and a world redefining moment. And so there's nothing within the terms of this world that's going to do that. We have to think much more expansively about this. But the first thing I do want to make a note, even as a historian, around the ways in which elite is often used to delegitimize Black people and their political action. It is something that, yes, I think it's important to talk about that, but there's this idea that the only authentic African is a barefooted African woman who we can see she has a threadbare dress, and that's the only person who can speak with authority. That's the authentic African experience. And I think we really need to get away from this idea that that is what Africanness necessarily depends. And even in the for the Black world more broadly, the idea is that we are always illegitimate as long as we're not spouting a conservative idea, right? That's where, for example, in South Africa, get the idea of clever Blacks. That's where there's always this idea of an educated Black person, so-called educated Black person, and that's usually a mark against educated versus Western educated. This is a perennial debate that has always dogged Black people who have any access to limited power, because our power is not structural power in relation to the powers that really actually define the world. So a Black woman who's a lecturer at a university somehow has the same amount of power as Trump and America. That's a super sovereign state. So I think let's just be a little bit reticent about how we use elite to delegitimize marginalized people, because then we're always looking for the most oppressed African woman as the only legitimate voice. And I think we just need to think about this a little bit more carefully. And we always are suspicious of them unless they're being chaperoned by white donors or white spaces. And I think we need to just be worried about, or think a little bit more carefully around our suspicions. That's not the same as not having a class analysis. That's different. I'm just speaking to the ways in which people are delegitimized for having any access to some forms of power and agency. I think that's quite important. The second thing is just on apologies. A couple of years ago, I did an address at the, I think it was Sam Nelson Mandela lecture, and it was on Xolisa Ngani with what are you apologizing? The point being that if we think about, and again, think about our own modes of restorative justice, you do not say sorry with your mouth. A sorry is incomplete without the material form of that. So for us, if you are just saying sorry, it does not become anything until there's a materialization of that sorry. And that's quite important for us to understand. That's why there's also ways in which we have to be critical and also look at what is the terms and the substance of these apologies. For example, the Nama Herero genocide, there's a long point at which they would not name it a genocide, for example. And they said at the time, it would not have been understood as a genocide, right? According to them. And that's even, again, who has the right to decide and to define the terms of justice. So I think that's quite important for us to think about. Again, this is where we see the operationalization of the Africa exception. Whenever there is any so-called form of acknowledgement to people of African descent, it is never called reparations. It is always a regret for something that is now seen as a problem or now seen as a crime, but at the time was not seen as a crime. And essentially what they're saying is that we do not recognize that your ancestors understood this as a crime. According to a modern imposition of values, we are apologizing. So I think it's quite important that we think very substantively, and when we go through with this reparations agenda, is thinking about what is the substance of what is actually being said, because that's quite important, because they're limiting liability with that, and in particular, they do not recognize us as sovereign states. That is why it is always framed with those caveats and those qualifications. And secondly, it is because we are still understood as a site of sovereign or capital accumulation. The next point and the last point that I think is, again, to really, really emphasize, during the 9 wars of dispossession in South Africa, Xhosa people were known to say ilizwe lifile, which is the world is dead. And not just the world or the land is dead, that there is a cosmological rupture. That's why we hear on the East African coast, Kifaurongo, this idea as a death-dealing kind of idea, that we are zombies. That's what they speak about in the diaspora. And I'm naming all of these different things. This is Sukuyan, because Black people are speaking to the fact that this is not just a question of trauma, a question of healing, that we are reduced to a state of non-being. Our worlds were destroyed. It's not just land was taken, it is worlds that are destroyed. So therefore, anything that is up to the task of reparations must be a world-building exercise. Within the terms of our own cosmologies, we understood that this was a fundamental rupture. This fundamentally ended the world as we know it. And therefore, a reparations agenda up to the task must be a world rebuilding project. And that's why, again, it has been quite important, insofar as I can push this as part of the AU, is understanding that this must be based in the assertion of the sovereignty of African being and ways of understanding and ways of knowing and our terms of justice, to say that our languages, our ways of knowing justice, our own legal traditions, we are asserting the sovereignty of that. And if that is deemed insufficient, it is proof of the continued non-sovereign status of us as African people in the world. And that's quite important. And that's why, again, in the very title, A Crime Does Not Rot, because if you go through the historical record, for those of you who are in London, I'm going to be doing a lecture next month at SOA, speaking to the history of Africans contesting this war over time. They're specifically contesting the criminalization of a crime does not rot. Native commissioners are saying our native courts are backed up because these natives have elephants' memories. They're bringing court cases that come from their grandfather's time. People like Lord Shepstone, who are really central to the development of what we now know as customary law, which we know was a bastardization of our own indigenous jurisprudence. They were very deliberate about saying that we need to end the ways in which these natives do justice, because we cannot have these cases rolling on. And that really is a broader way of understanding this fundamental clash over what is time, what is being in the world. That is really at the heart of this. This is beyond, as Lebogang has been saying, I'm so glad she's been speaking. It is a question of sovereignty at every level. It is bodily sovereignty, it is temporal sovereignty, it is territorial sovereignty, all of those aspects, epistemic sovereignty. And that's why, again, it becomes quite important. If we do not actually model that ourselves, Europe will never give you epistemic sovereignty. You can't beg Europe to do that on your behalf. If we ourselves do not take our knowledge systems seriously, who else is going to do that for us? And it's quite important for us as Africans to understand the world at a geopolitical level, those of us now also operating with these world systems, and I'm glad that Toni spoke about this, we're seeing the end of a particular world order made after 1948, the so-called rules-based international order. We're seeing a multipolar world. So many things are up for grabs. And us as Africans must understand that we must think very carefully about how do we impose our own sovereignty in this moment, because nobody, I can tell you for sure, is going to give us a reparations agenda that is fitting to the task. That is us, and to decide what are we willing to give up to have the world that we want. That is the most important. And that's why there's a huge concept around internal repair. How do we fundamentally understand ourselves differently? And how do we impose that? Because I can tell you, Europe understands that the moment they give us anything, their world as they know it. That's why France is bankrupt right now, because they know that everything that they have is based on us. It's built on our backs. So once we have that understanding that we are the wombs of the world and it's up to us to stand up and to impose those costs, I think we'll see a very, very different picture with this reparations discourse. It is fundamentally a vehicle for a new world order, and it's up to us to be brave enough to put that forth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've gone above time. So I'm wondering if we can take another, 10 minutes just to listen to other voices. And I'm going to invite Lebonha to spend maybe 3 minutes. I don't know if I can hold Lebonha for 3 minutes, to talk about this issue of time theft. And I see two more comments from Rosebell, and maybe Rosebell can take another 2 minutes. And there's another question for Marumo, who can also speak like for 1 minute. And then we round it up, hopefully in another 10 to 15 minutes. I'm sorry, people, but it's been an interesting conversation. I'm struggling to say, let's stop. So if you don't mind, please hang on with us if you have the time, and let us pull this. Lebonha, welcome. So
Thanks.
speak more
Welcome.
about this time theft and reparations.
Okay,
3 minutes, Lebonha. Yes.
I've got you. Thanks. Thanks so much to all the sisters, Toni, Njoki, and Panashe, who always makes my heart swell because I've been watching you over the years. But I wanted to just say that I think in terms of reparations, and when we think about time, we have to think about the non-linearity of time, because one of the things that's really useful and interesting is the elasticity of time when it is applied to non-white people. So when we speak about the infractions against us, we are told that it was a long time ago, even if it was yesterday. Already we saw the BAFTA Awards, for example, and the way-ins in which there's this false pain Olympics, because, well, you need to be used to acclimatized to abuse. And yet when capital and imperialism want to extract from us, they want things now, and yet we must be held in abeyance infinitely. I think the other thing as well, on a final note, is also to think about how time is a thief of future, right? How time is a thief of futures, and that when we're thinking around reparations, it's not only for what was taken, the tangible and the intangible, everything that you said, Panashe and Toni, and Njoki, around languages and cultures and ways of being and cosmologies. But now when we think about, AI and digitalization and potential, and I think in this talk that I just gave, I spoke about the theft of futures, right? And how that we need to rethink the ability to inhabit futures, the loss of potential, and what might be, as well as part of a site of struggle. And I'll leave it right there. I think that's 2.5 minutes.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. It's important we get these different perspectives. Rosebell, do you want to come in and speak a bit about the aspect of religion?
Thanks everyone. It's really been amazing listening to all of you. It's really a reflection. I don't have like a statement about it. For me, it's always very concerning when we speak about colonization and harm and repair, that constantly the question of spirituality is left. We are very uncomfortable because many of us have been socialized to believe that, I don't know, Jesus or other gods that had been inculcated in your psyche, that we can't even bring ourselves to question that, and we see that, and we happen to be in the middle of resurgence of, fundamentalism taking over our countries, and we cannot hide away from the use of religion as a tool of destroying the African continent. Whatever religion you might see, you might find liberatory aspects of those who fought back, but really the idea of destruction of African belief in themselves is spirituality is at the heart of it. And in countries like Uganda and other British colonies, we saw the destruction of people's what's the right English people's places of worship. I call that a place of worship, people's altars. They would force people in my village to come and shame them to come to the public square to say, I have burnt everything my ancestors left me. I no longer believe in this. That happened. There was a whole hunt for generations, and people continue to feel that shame, but we refuse to talk about it, and we cover ourselves. Or even when they're talking about Uganda, Uganda is something percent Christian. But what is that? What is that Christianity? This place is I don't know, whatever percent Muslim. We refuse to interrogate our own identities and the forced identities that are being imposed again and again in different ways. So I don't have answers to it, but for me, ultimately, in the struggle for African unity and African sovereignty, we must seek African spiritual sovereignty. So I don't know what other people think about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So while you think about your 1 minute response to everything, our panelists, Marumo, do you want to come in and speak about climate change? I see you comment on this issue about climate change. Are you still on the call? Okay, well, she says, my work is mostly on climate justice, but I'm self-educating to shift to feminist climate justice. Some of my experiences with grassroots actors to the experts in climate action is the denial of a crime and an uphill battle. What programming is required to catch up everyone on recognizing the crime and recognizing how it has manifested in the modern era? A transformative justice should be inclusive. I think it's more of a comment, but it's also something that, you talked about, and also Njoki talked about. I think it was Njoki or Toni who talked about environmental justice, as part of reparations. So she's probably looking for what practical steps, can be taken. So let's do 1 minute as closing remarks from each of you, and we can go away from here. But what I'm seeing is that we need more conversations around this, and probably something that we need to talk about and see how we bring everyone. Can we have some examples of the materiality of apologies? That's another question. Please consider that in your in your closing. Powerful point on religiosity and its role in our continued subjugation and enslavement of the African mind. Yeah. So let the conversation continue in the chat, but we're about to close now. So I'm giving our panelists 1 minute, just your thoughts, and we close. Probably we need more time to get back into these conversations. I will start with Toni.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. Maybe to the question of, the religiosity, and I think the issue is that it's so embedded in, and philosophy of religion is not static in of itself. So its embeddedness in culture, in the everyday, I think requires unlearning. And I think maybe that is also then linked to that question around climate change. How do you, if you're sort of taking that sort of African eco-feminist lens, how do you convince people that this was actually a crime? Well, I don't think, at least from my perspective, that can happen through programming. That has to be through a process of unlearning. So if you were thinking about it in programming terms, then, you can think of it as a sort of decolonial education of sorts, because this denial did not just happen overnight. I think, as Panashe articulated, it has taken centuries. So how can we expect that, in an afternoon, in a day, in a month, that we will convince people that, okay, so this is not just harmful, but you need to think about those harms in very, very specific ways. One of the feminist scholars I like, Cynthia Enloe, she always says, actually, feminist work is hard. But that's kind of how we persist, because you need to expect that all the systems of oppression as they exist, they reinforce themselves to keep pushing back against any sort of progress that we made. And to Leborhan's point, none of this, we cannot look at this as linear. And the ways in which we respond to those harms, the ways in which we respond to education to date also has to ensure that we are not looking linearly. So the only thing I can say is keep trying, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Njoki, Panashe is going to close for us.
Um, I totally agree. I think with the conversation, the point Roosevelt and Toni have made, and I like the point on Lebohan made about, wow, decolonizing time. So I just want to appreciate those sisters for that, and to say that I think we need to recognize that if colonialism extracted our resources, our time, our dignity, then neoliberalism also continues to extract our care, and so how do we not just care, healing our ethics, and of course neoliberalism with its best friends, which is capitalism, white racism, white capitalism, violence. So all these go hand in hand. And so how do we keep returning the ethic of care, of course, which goes with healing, and the ethic of care, and center it within also feminist justice, as and not just feminist justice, but feminists create these feminist justice ethics of care infrastructures at the global level. So whether it means, I don't know what we will do to capture the economic system. I know we have an African Black feminists sitting there, like in the WTO, but it's not even enough, because that's a token. How do we shift the whole system? And I think many times also because the system is so huge, this white capitalist patriarchal system of violence, as neoliberal system, by I think every day doing this, coming back to the everyday. And I would like to, we can borrow a lot from our Latin American sisters and also African women. They've been doing that. Like, I don't know each of you, but in Kenya we have something we call chamas. Women groups that come together. There are spaces for healing. There are spaces for creating alternative economics, which is based on, again, a lot of ethics of care. They do not just exchange money and give each other small loans. They are also, at the front line of healing work for each other. So how do we center these systems, which used to be there before this 1444 and colonialism? So how do we recenter ourselves, basically, in our ways of being? Because I'm saying colonialism extracted resources, but then neoliberalism extracts care. And so returning that as part of feminist justice and getting it back is what reparations. I'll stop there. You're muted, Helen.
1 minute, Panashe, to close us up. I said Njoki did more than 1 minute. It's okay. Please go ahead. You're muted, Panashe.
As a military historian, and I think it's important to also state, because I think, especially because we've been speaking about care and the ways in which we sometimes veer away from Black women taking power in particular kinds of ways, and understanding that we are in a state of war. Once you decide to take my child and decide to rip them away from me or anyone else in my community, you have declared war upon me. You have declared war upon my body and my people. And that state of warfare has not ended. It has mutated, but it has not ended. And this is something that is quite important, going through the archive and understanding that this is a 6th century tradition that we are stepping ourselves into. And understanding that this is war. It's not going to be random acts of sabotage. It's going to require an incredible amount amount of discipline on our part, an incredible amount of patience as well, understanding that we are in a long lineage and it might not be that we win in our generation, but that doesn't mean it is not important. Our future generations need to know that our ancestors loved us enough to do this work. And that's how I think about this, that it might not be in my generation, but it does not mean I don't fight tooth and nail and put everything that I have in me, because my future generations need to know, just like my ancestors need to know, that I love them enough to do this work. That's what I feel when I see Njinga. That's what I feel when I see Nehanda, who have always been at the center. Thank you, Rosebell, for speaking about the spiritual. There's a reason why our spiritual traditions had African women at the center. It was the source of power because we did not have a separation between the spiritual and political. That is why it is so political and incredibly gendered, that our spiritual traditions were attacked, because every single revolutionary movement across the Black world, whether it's the Haitian Revolution and Fatima, whether it's the Chimurenga and Nehanda, there's always been Black women as spiritual and political and military leaders. That's incredibly important for us to understand. And that brings us to the nexus of understanding that this fundamentally is a question of sovereignty, sovereignty over our time, sovereignty over our bodies, sovereignty over our territories, sovereignty over our intellectual production. That's really, really important. And it begins with us. So I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done. And in particular, thank you to the collective for doing this work and convening us here and doing this work. It continues, Aluta continua. And if there's nothing that we remember, we are the wombs of the world as we know it, and we have it within us to birth a new world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Panashe. A lot of people are re-echoing what you've just said in the chat. People are going away understanding that Africa is the womb of the world. And I like the way you've ended us powerfully. It is in our hands to determine, which way do we lead Africa? How do we reaffirm ourselves, within our spirituality, within our beliefs, but also within our motherhood, as African women, to continue this conversation. Thank you, everyone who has stayed till the end. It's been an exciting webinar for me as well. I've learned so much, and I hope and I know that this conversation will continue. Thank you so much, Njoki. Thank you, Toni. Thank you, Panashe. Thank you, participants. And I hope you have a lovely evening and enjoy your weekend. Tomorrow is Friday. And I hope that we connect very soon. Please have a look at the paper. The link has been shared, and we continue to share this. Thank you so much. And our colleague Pauline, who has been working at the background, thank you so much for putting this webinar together. You're always doing this very well, like Toni said, always putting us in the right order to get things done. And most times we can't say no to Pauline. Thank you so much, Pauline. We really appreciate this effort. And thank you so much, everyone. We hope you have a lovely evening, and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Njoki. Thanks, everyone. Please, Pauline, can you reshare the link for the paper?